Violent pounding woke me at midnight. My daughter was outside with a tire iron, screaming, "Open this door now!" I froze. Suddenly, a calm voice behind me said, "Stay behind me. I've got the door." I opened it. When they saw who was standing beside me, her face went pale. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened after that, but none of it will make sense unless I tell you how a 63-year-old man ended up standing in his own front hallway at midnight with his brother-in-law at his shoulder and his daughter on the porch holding a tire iron like it was the only thing keeping her upright. It didn't happen overnight. It took the better part of a year, and looking back now, I can point to the exact dinner where it started, though I didn't understand what I was looking at until much later. So let me start there. I grew up in a house where money wasn't discussed much at the dinner table, mostly because there wasn't enough of it to make discussing it interesting. My father worked in a machine shop for 34 years, the kind of job that wears a man's hands down to leather and his patience down to almost nothing by the time he gets home. He had a saying he repeated so often it eventually stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like weather, just something that was always there in the background of my childhood. The only thing a man owns outright is his word and his work, he'd say. Everything else, somebody bigger can take from you if you're not careful. I understood the words for most of my life without understanding what he meant underneath them. Not really. Not until I was almost 70, and it turned out to be the truest thing anybody ever told me. I started working construction at 19, framing houses through summers where the heat made your shirt stick to your back by 8 in the morning. I liked the work more than I expected to. There's something clean about building a thing with your hands and being able to point at it later and say, "I did that. I know exactly how it was made." By 26, I had my contractor's license. By 34, I'd started my own outfit, a small remodeling and restoration business that specialized in older homes, the kind most crews didn't have the patience for because the work was slow and demanded more care than speed. Turned out there were plenty of homeowners in our area who wanted their old houses saved rather than gutted, and I built a reputation doing exactly that, one house at a time, one referral at a time, for almost 3 decades. I met my wife when I was 22, at a friend's engagement party I almost didn't go to. She was a school teacher, the kind of woman who could walk into a room full of arguing men and make all of them quiet down without raising her voice. We married 2 years later in her parents' backyard, and from the beginning she had a way of taking the parts of me that ran too hot and cooling them down just enough. We had 2 children, our son first, then our daughter 3 years after that. I won't spend long on our son, because there are things a person carries privately, even while telling the rest of the story out loud, but I'll say this much. We lost him when he was 19, in a car accident on a road he'd driven 100 times before, on a night that started ordinary and ended with a phone call. I still hear sometimes when the house is too quiet. After that, everything in our family reorganized itself around the child we had left. I don't think either my wife or I did that on purpose. Grief doesn't ask permission before it rearranges your priorities. Our daughter became, without either of us ever saying it plainly, the only thing left that we hadn't already lost, and I think now, with the benefit of a lot of hindsight, that we probably gave her too much of ourselves in the years after. The kind of attention that feels like love from the outside, but can sometimes curdle into something a person never quite learns to stand on their own 2 feet without. I'm not saying that to excuse anything that happened later. I'm telling you this now, since it matters for understanding how a person ends up standing on her father's porch at midnight with a tire iron in her hand. My wife passed 6 years ago. A stroke, fast, no real warning, gone before the ambulance even got her to the hospital doors. I won't pretend the years since have been easy. The house still has some of her things exactly where she left them, not because I'm incapable of moving a coffee mug or a stack of books, but because moving them feels like agreeing she's not coming back, and some part of me still isn't ready to agree to that, even 6 years later. By the time she passed, my daughter had already been married about 2 years to a man who sold commercial insurance for a living. He wore a different watch practically every time I saw him, always something with a brand name I didn't recognize, and he seemed eager for me to ask about. He had opinions about how I ran my business, despite never having swung a hammer or managed a crew a day in his life. And he had a habit of talking about money the way some men talk about sports scores, casually, constantly, like it was simply the most interesting subject available at any given moment. I never disliked him outright, not in those early years. I just never fully trusted the way he looked at things that weren't his yet. There's a particular kind of attention some people pay to other people's success, an attention that isn't admiration and isn't envy exactly either, but something adjacent to both, patient and calculating in a way that's hard to name until you've seen where it leads. For a while after my wife died, things between our 2 households seemed fine on the surface. Sunday dinners continued. My daughter called to check on me more often than she had before, which I appreciated without questioning it too closely. I told myself grief had simply brought us closer together, the way it sometimes does with the people you have left. I was wrong about a great deal that year, and I understand now that was the first thing I was wrong about. I should explain what exactly was at stake here because I think it matters for understanding what came next. My business wasn't a fortune by any stretch, but it was a real something. 3 decades of contracts, 4 active crews, a warehouse full of architectural salvage worth considerably more than most people would guess just looking at it, reclaimed doors and mantels and stained glass from houses torn torn down decades ago, and a client list that included some of the wealthier families in the county who trusted me with projects most contractors wouldn't have the patience or the eye for. I also owned my house outright, along with a small rental property downtown that had paid for itself years earlier, plus a modest set of investments my wife and I had built the boring way over 3 decades of steady contribution rather than any single lucky break. None of it was extravagant. I never wanted extravagant, but it added up to something worth protecting, and more importantly, something worth passing down carefully to the right hands in the right way when the time eventually came. I mention all this now because about 10 months before that midnight pounding on my door, my daughter started asking questions that sounded at first like ordinary concern. Are you sleeping all right, Dad? Have you seen the doctor recently? Are you sure you're not doing too much at the warehouse at your age? I answered all of it honestly because I had no reason not to. I slept fine. I saw my doctor twice a year like clockwork and always had. And yes, I still liked walking the warehouse floor most mornings because sitting still had never suited me and wasn't about to start suiting me just because I'd turned 63. Then my son-in-law started coming to those same Sunday dinners with questions of his own, about my will, about whether I'd set anything up in a trust, about whether I'd considered handing the business over to someone younger who could really grow it, by which he obviously meant himself, despite never having managed so much as a lemonade stand in his life. I didn't think much of any of it at first. People get curious about inheritance. It's not a crime to wonder what happens to a thing after the person holding it is gone. I chalked it up to a son-in-law feeling restless in his own career and looking sideways at mine. The real conversation happened on a Thursday evening about 4 months before everything came apart. We were sitting around my dining table, the good plates out because my daughter always insisted on the good plates for Sunday dinners, even though I'd told her 100 times I didn't care either way. And my son-in-law set his fork down with a kind of ceremony that should have warned me something was coming. I want to talk to you about something, he said, an opportunity, something that could really set the family up long term. He told me about a man he knew, someone he described as extremely well connected, who could take a lump sum and turn it over in 90 days at returns that, when he said the actual number out loud, made no sense to anyone who understood how money actually worked. I asked who this man was. My son-in-law got vague in that particular way people get vague when they're hoping you won't ask a second time. Said he was the kind of person you don't really explain, you just trust, and that trust was exactly the point of family helping family. I said no, plainly, without much explanation beyond the truth, which was that I didn't hand money to people I couldn't look in the eye, and I'd never once in 30 years made an investment I didn't fully understand from top to bottom. You don't understand how these things work anymore, Dad, my son-in-law said, an edge of impatience creeping into his voice for the first time that evening. The world's different now. Fortune favors people willing to move fast. Fortune, I said, also tends to find the people who move fast without looking where they're stepping. My daughter's face changed the moment I said it. Not dramatically, not right away, but I saw something close behind her eyes, like a door swinging shut on a room I'd been allowed into a moment earlier. You never trust my judgment, she said. You still see me like I'm 19 and can't make a decision without you checking it first. This has nothing to do with trust, I told her. This is common sense. I don't invest in things I can't see the shape of. She didn't say much after that. She left the table early that night, claiming a headache, and my son-in-law stayed a while longer making small talk that felt more like damage control than conversation. Things between us stayed cool for a couple of weeks after that dinner. Then, the way these things sometimes do, the whole subject seemed to simply evaporate. Nobody brought it up again. I assumed, wrongly, that meant they'd dropped it entirely. I want to be honest about something. I noticed small things in the weeks that followed, and I ignored almost all of them, because noticing a thing and admitting what it means to yourself are two very different exercises, and I was better at the first one than the second. My daughter stopped calling as often as she used to. When she did call, the conversations felt shorter, more like check-ins than actual talking. My son-in-law started avoiding eye contact at the dinners that still happened, which weren't as regular as they'd once been. Once, dropping by unannounced to bring over a bookshelf I'd built for their spare room, I noticed a folder on their kitchen counter with a logo I didn't recognize, something with an eagle and a set of numbers underneath it that looked more like a template than an actual company letterhead. My son-in-law swept it into a drawer before I could ask about it, laughing off the question with something about junk mail that didn't quite land as casually as he wanted it to. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself a man who'd spent his whole career building things with his hands didn't necessarily understand the way younger people talked about money now, that maybe this was simply how business conversations sounded to somebody my age, unfamiliar and therefore suspicious by default. I was wrong about that too. I was wrong about a great many things during those months, and the pattern looking back was always the same. Every time some part of me noticed something off, I found a reasonable sounding explanation and filed the worry away instead of following it. I should mention my grandson here, because he mattered more to what happened than any of the financial details did, at least to me. He was 7 at the time, my daughter's only child, and Saturday mornings had belonged to us for years by that point. A standing tradition where I'd pick him up and we'd spend a few hours at the warehouse together, him helping me sort salvage pieces in a way that mostly meant asking me 100 questions about why old houses were built the way they were, and me answering every single one because I genuinely loved watching him find the same things fascinating that I'd found fascinating at his age. He'd started asking, around the time all of this began, whether he could learn to fix old houses like I did when he grew up. I told him absolutely, that I'd teach him anything he wanted to learn the moment he was old enough to hold a hammer properly, and he'd grinned at me like I'd just handed him the best news of his entire short life. I mention this because somewhere in the months that followed, those Saturday mornings started disappearing without much explanation. First, it was a scheduling conflict, then another, then a pattern I couldn't ignore no matter how many reasonable explanations I tried to talk myself into. I didn't understand yet that my daughter was quietly pulling him away from me, the same way people sometimes distance themselves from someone before doing something they know that someone would object to. I didn't know it yet, but I felt it, the way you feel weather changing before you can point to any specific cloud that proves it. The thing that finally cracked the whole picture open wasn't anything my brother-in-law told me. It was something I found myself on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon going through a joint account statement I hadn't looked at closely in longer than I should admit. I kept a modest account that fed into a college fund I'd set up years earlier for my grandson, still young enough that the fund hadn't needed any attention in a while. I only checked it every few months, usually just to confirm the automatic contribution had gone through and nothing more. That particular Tuesday, for no reason I can fully explain except maybe some instinct finally deciding to surface after months of being talked down, I actually read through every line instead of just glancing at the balance. There were 2 withdrawals I didn't recognize, small enough on their own that they might have passed for bank fees if you weren't looking closely, but paired together and dated only a few days apart, they read less like an accident and more like someone testing whether anyone was paying attention. The withdrawals were routed to an account name I didn't recognize, something generic enough to sound legitimate and vague enough to mean nothing if you tried to look it up casually. I sat with that discovery for 2 full days before I told anyone. I wanted to be sure I wasn't building a conspiracy out of nothing, the way a person sometimes will when grief and suspicion have both been sitting too long in the same chest, but the more I looked, the less it looked like nothing. I called my accountant, a meticulous woman who'd handled my books for over 2 decades and had never once let a number slip past her without accounting for it. I asked her to run a full audit, not just of the business accounts this time, but of everything connected to my name and my late wife's name. Every account, every fund, every joint signature that existed anywhere in our financial history. She told me it would take about a week to do it properly. I told her to take whatever time she needed and to call me the moment she found anything, no matter how small. While I waited for that audit, something happened that I didn't see coming at all, though looking back I probably should have, given how these things tend to connect once you finally have the full picture. My brother-in-law had never been what you'd call a stable presence in the family. He was my late wife's younger brother, a man who'd spent most of his adult life bouncing between decent jobs and worse decisions, the kind of person everyone loved at family gatherings and worried about privately the rest of the year. He'd had a run of bad luck with a business of his own years earlier, a used car lot that folded under debt he'd never fully explained to anyone, and since then he'd worked a string of sales jobs that never quite stuck, always one bad month away from serious trouble. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that about 8 months before all this came to a head, he'd gotten desperate enough to fall in with people who specialized in exactly the kind of desperation he was carrying. He owed money, real money, to people who didn't send polite reminder letters when a payment was late, and somewhere in the process of trying to dig himself out of that hole, he'd started doing exactly what those people needed him to do, which was recruit new money into a scheme dressed up convincingly enough to fool people who trusted him. I want to be clear that I didn't know any of this yet. I only found out the full shape of it later, piece by piece, some of it from him directly, and some of it from documents that came out during everything that followed. But I'm telling you now, out of order, because it matters for understanding why he ended up on my doorstep the week before everything else happened, looking like a man who hadn't slept properly in longer than he wanted to admit. 2 days before my brother-in-law showed up at my door, my grandson called me himself, which he almost never did on his own, always going through his mother's phone first. He asked, in the careful, rehearsed way 7-year-olds sometimes talk when they've been coached without fully understanding why, whether I was feeling okay lately, whether I'd been forgetting things. I told him I felt exactly the same as I always had, which was true, and asked him why he wanted to know. Mom said you might need extra help soon, he said. She said it's normal for grandpas to need help sometimes. I kept my voice steady on that call in a way that cost me more than I let on. I told him I appreciated him checking on me, that I loved our Saturday mornings and missed them, and that nothing was wrong with me that he needed to worry about. He seemed satisfied enough to move on to telling me about a salvage piece he'd found in one of my old catalogs, a stained glass window he thought was the prettiest thing he'd ever seen. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time without moving. Whatever plan was taking shape behind all of this, my daughter had already started laying groundwork with the one person whose trust in me actually mattered more to me than any account balance ever could. That was the moment the whole thing stopped feeling like a financial problem to solve and started feeling like something closer to a war I hadn't agreed to be part of, fought with a 7-year-old's understanding of what was true as one of the opening moves. He showed up on a Wednesday evening, a week before the pounding that would eventually wake me at midnight, standing on my porch in a jacket jacket that looked slept in, hands shoved so deep in his pockets I could see the knuckles pressing against the fabric. "Can I come in?" he said. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you decide what to do about me." I let him in. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd later lay out a manila folder, though neither of us knew that yet, and he talked for close to an hour without much interruption from me, because I could tell interrupting him would only give him an excuse to stop before he'd said everything he'd clearly worked up the nerve to say. He told me about the debt first, told me about the people he owed and what they'd started threatening once his payments slowed down. Then he told me about the arrangement he'd made to work some of that debt off, recruiting money into what he'd been told was a private investment fund, the kind of thing that sounded plausible enough on paper that he'd convinced himself, at least in the beginning, that it might even be legitimate. "How did you even get pulled into something like that?" I asked him. "You've never been a stupid man, whatever else people say about you. Desperation doesn't care how smart you are," he said. "It just cares whether you're scared enough to stop asking the right questions." I stopped asking the right questions about a year ago, and I've been paying for it every day since. "It wasn't a fund," he said. "I figured that out too late to matter. It's a laundering operation. They take real money in from real people, run it through enough shell accounts that it comes out clean on the other side, and by the time anybody notices, the money that went in isn't coming back out, not to the people who put it there." "And my son-in-law," I said, already feeling something go cold and still in my chest, the way water does right before it freezes. "He came to me a while back," my brother-in-law said, not knowing I was already tangled up in it, or maybe knowing exactly that and figuring it made me safer to approach than a stranger would have been. I told him it was solid. I believed it was solid, at least enough to say it out loud without choking on the words. "He put money in, your daughter's money from what he told me, and it's gone, the same way everyone else's is gone." "How much?" I asked. He named a number that made the room feel smaller than it had a moment earlier. "I'm not telling you this to save myself," he said. "I know what telling you this probably costs me, with your family, and maybe with the people I still owe. But I've spent 8 months protecting people who'd bury me the second it stopped being convenient to keep me around, and I'd rather sit in whatever's left of this family being honest than keep protecting them one more day." I didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I asked him if he had anywhere else to stay, and when he said he didn't, not anywhere he actually felt safe, I told him he could use my guest room for as long as he needed it. I called my lawyer first thing the next morning. The lawyer I found was a sharp, no-nonsense woman who'd spent 15 years handling exactly this kind of case, elderly clients targeted by family members either through outright fraud or through the slower, quieter route of having someone declared incompetent so their decisions could be legally overridden. When I laid out everything I knew so far, she didn't look surprised, which was somehow more unsettling than if she had been. "You have 2 paths in front of you," she told me. "You can confront this now, which gets loud and messy fast, or you can quietly build your defenses first and let them walk into a wall they don't see coming." I asked how much time I needed. 90 days would be comfortable," she said. "You may only have 30, depending on how fast things are already moving on their end." So I got to work immediately. First, I had my accountant expand the audit she'd already started, this time specifically tracing every dollar that had moved through any account connected to my son-in-law's limited access, which had been granted 18 months earlier when my daughter convinced me he could help modernize some of the business invoicing. Second, I restructured my entire estate into an irrevocable trust that neither my daughter nor her husband could access or even view the terms of without a court order. Third, I rewrote my will completely, adding language that any attempt to have me declared legally incompetent would result in automatic and permanent forfeiture of inheritance, a clause my lawyer told me was aggressive, but exactly the kind of deterrent that mattered in cases like mine. Fourth, I changed every lock on the house. I understood, with a clarity that honestly scared me a little, that once my daughter and her husband realized what I'd done, they weren't going to take it quietly. Whatever quietly might have looked like from 2 people who'd already decided lying to me was easier than being honest with me. My lawyer also recommended, given the scope of what we were dealing with, that I document every interaction going forward, every phone call, every visit, every conversation, in case any of it became relevant later in a courtroom, rather than just around a kitchen table. I started keeping a written log, dates and times and exact quotes, where I could remember them precisely, a habit that felt strange and almost paranoid at first, but that I came to be grateful for as the following weeks unfolded. I also had a small security company install cameras at every entrance to the house, and I hired a private investigator to confirm what my brother-in-law's confession had already made me suspect, that my son-in-law had been laying additional groundwork behind the scenes, meeting with an attorney friend to discuss the possibility of a formal incompetency petition, regardless of whatever I might say or show him directly. My accountant's expanded audit came back 9 days later, longer than she'd originally estimated, because what she found took considerably more untangling than either of us expected. My son-in-law's access, granted for what was supposed to be simple invoicing help, had been used to route money through 2 vendor accounts that didn't actually exist as functioning businesses, invoices for consulting services that had never been performed, payments for restoration materials that were never delivered to any job site. All of it traced back, eventually, to shell accounts connected to the same laundering operation my brother-in-law had already described to me, though my accountant hadn't known that context when she started pulling the threads herself. The total came to just over $200,000. Money that should have gone toward crew wages, material costs, and a retirement fund I'd promised 4 of my longest employees years earlier as a thank you for staying with me through some genuinely difficult seasons in the business. I thought about those 4 employees for a long while after I saw that number. Men and women who trusted me with 2 decades of their working lives, who had no idea their retirement money had been quietly diverted to cover somebody else's desperation, separately. And this was the part that actually took my breath for a moment when I read it. My daughter's inheritance from her mother, an account she'd had access to since turning 30, had been almost entirely drained over the same period, funneled into the same operation under the belief, or at least the story she'd apparently been told, that it was a legitimate short-term investment that would pay itself back within months. I sat with those numbers for a long time before I called my lawyer to tell her what we'd found. This isn't just conservatorship fraud anymore, if that's even what this ends up being called, she said. This is documented embezzlement, and it's clean enough that we can move on it hard whenever you're ready. I told her I wasn't ready yet, not completely. There was still a small, stubborn part of me hoping there was some explanation that made all of this survivable as a family, even though every piece of evidence in front of me was quietly telling me there wasn't. The days after that audit felt different in a way I can't fully explain except to say that the house itself seemed to hold its breath along with me. I hadn't confronted my daughter or her husband with anything yet. My lawyer had advised waiting until every piece of the legal groundwork was fully in place, and I'd agreed, though every day of waiting felt like carrying something heavy across a room I couldn't quite see the far side of. My daughter called twice that week, both times sounding strangely bright, almost performatively cheerful in a way that didn't match the coolness that had settled between us over the previous months. Once she asked, seemingly out of nowhere, whether I'd given any more thought to setting up power of attorney just in case, phrasing it like a responsible daughter's precaution rather than what I now understood it actually was. My private investigator called on a Thursday to confirm that my son-in-law had met with his attorney friend twice more that week, and that a document referencing cognitive assessment scheduling had been drafted, though not yet filed. My brother-in-law, still sleeping in my guest room most nights, grew visibly more anxious as the week went on, checking his phone constantly, flinching at unexpected sounds outside. "They know something's different," he told me one evening, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He wasn't really drinking. "I don't know exactly what they know, but they know something. People don't stay this quiet when everything's actually fine." I didn't sleep well that week. I kept thinking about my father's saying, about the only thing a man really owns being his word and his work, and I kept wondering what he would have made of a daughter willing to trade both of those things away for a number in an account she hadn't earned herself. 11 days after my brother-in-law first sat down at my kitchen table and told me the truth, I went to bed at my usual time, read a few pages of a book I'd been slowly working through for weeks, and turned off the lamp beside my recliner sometime around 10:30. My brother-in-law was staying up later than usual that night, something restless in him that I noticed but didn't ask about directly. He'd mentioned earlier that evening that he thought something might happen soon, though he couldn't say exactly what, just a feeling built up from years of knowing how people behave when they've realized they're cornered and haven't yet decided how far they're willing to go to get uncornered. I remember lying in bed for a while before actually falling asleep, listening to the ordinary sounds of the house settling, the furnace kicking on, a car passing somewhere out on the main road. I remember thinking, right before sleep finally took me, that whatever was coming, I'd at least done everything within my power to prepare for it. I didn't know yet exactly what preparation would actually look like in practice. I was about to find out. The pounding started sometime after 11, violent enough that I was upright and out of bed before I was even fully awake, my heart going hard enough that I could feel it in my ears. Through the front window, in the spill of the porch light, I saw my daughter standing there, something metal gripped in her hand that took my sleep-fogged brain a full second longer than it should have to identify as a tire iron. "Open this door right now!" she was screaming, loud enough that lights were probably coming on in the houses on either side of mine. I froze in the front hallway, one hand on the wall, trying to make my body catch up to what my eyes were telling me was actually happening. Then, from just behind my shoulder, a voice I'd come to trust more than almost anyone left in my life said quietly, "Stay behind me. I've got the door." My brother-in-law stepped past me, steady enough that my own racing pulse felt almost embarrassing by comparison, and reached for the deadbolt before I could tell him to wait, before I could think through whether opening that door was even the right thing to do at 11 o'clock with my own daughter screaming on the other side of it, holding something that could put a man in the hospital. He opened it anyway. My daughter stood there under the porch light, tire iron still gripped tight enough that her knuckles had gone bloodless, her husband a half step behind her holding nothing but looking like he wished he was holding something too. She was already mid-sentence, already screaming something about needing to talk, needing me to sign something, needing this to be over tonight one way or another. Then her eyes moved past me to the man standing at my shoulder, and every bit of momentum in her seemed to drain out at once. The color left her face like someone had reached inside her and pulled a plug, leaving something gray and unsteady standing where a moment earlier there had been nothing but fury. "That's not possible," she said, her voice suddenly small in a way it hadn't been a second earlier. "You're supposed to be gone. He told me you ran." "I ran to the one person left in this family who still still tells the truth, my brother-in-law said. That's not the same thing as disappearing. Her husband found his voice before she found hers again. This is a family matter, he said. Get out of the way. You brought a tire iron to your father-in-law's porch at 11 o'clock at night, my brother-in-law said, his voice never rising above the same level he'd used the entire time. That stopped being a family matter the second you picked that up. The tire iron dropped an inch in my daughter's grip, like the words had physically weighed something onto it. We just wanted to talk to you, she said, looking at me now instead of him. With that? I asked. Is that what I am to you now? Something you have to break down a door to get through to? She didn't answer. Her husband recovered his nerve faster than she did. You think you're clever, he said, using a tone I'd never heard him use before. Something with an edge to it that had never been there in 6 years of Sunday dinners. Hiding money, turning your own daughter's family against her. I didn't turn anyone against anyone, I said. I just stopped being the only one in this family who didn't know what was actually happening. You don't know what you've started, he said, his voice cracking in a way it never had before. A man watching something he'd built come apart faster than he'd planned for. You think this ends with you feeling righteous on your own porch. It doesn't end there. Nothing ends where you think it does. Maybe not, I said, but it stops here, tonight, being something you can control with a tire iron and a threat. Whatever comes after this, it comes through lawyers and paperwork, not midnight visits. My daughter's face had gone from pale to something closer to stricken, and for just a moment before her husband's hand found her shoulder and steadied her back into whatever posture they'd rehearsed for this on the drive over, I saw something in her expression that looked almost like relief, like a person finally being caught at something they'd been carrying alone for too long to keep carrying quietly. Get off my porch, I said. Both of you, and don't come back until you're ready to tell me the truth instead of showing up here with something in your hand meant to scare it out of me. Neither of them moved right away. Then my daughter turned first, tire iron still hanging loose at her side, and walked back toward the car without another word, her husband following a step behind her, already talking low and fast in the particular tone of a man already rehearsing his next move. For a moment, standing there in the doorway with the porch light throwing long shadows across the yard, I thought about all the Sunday dinners that had led to this exact spot, all the small warnings I'd talked myself out of over the past year, and I understood that none of those dinners were ever going to happen again in the same way, whatever came next for any of us. I stood in my own doorway and watched their tail lights disappear down the street, my brother-in-law steady beside me the whole time, and I understood, standing there in my socks in the cold night air, that whatever came next, I was finally the one who got to decide what happened in my own front hallway.